She was 15 years old when the soldiers came. It was a Tuesday morning in a village in what is now northern Greece. The wheat was still green. Her mother was baking bread, and then the sound of horses changed everything. She didn't know the word harem yet. She would learn it by nightfall. The Ottoman Empire at its height didn't just conquer land, it consumed people. Specifically, it consumed young women from the Christian territories it controlled, absorbed them into a system so efficient and so total that most of them were never heard from again. What happened inside that system was documented, witnessed, and then very carefully buried by the people who ran it. This is what they buried. The road from the Greek village to Istanbul took 3 weeks on foot. 3 weeks of walking in a column of other girls, other women, none of them knowing exactly where they were going or what waited there. The guards didn't explain. There was nothing to explain. The destination was the destination. What happened when they arrived was not the guards' concern. Istanbul was the largest city in the world in the 16th century. 500,000 people, aqueducts, markets, libraries, and at its center, on a hill overlooking the Bosphorus, a palace complex so large it contained its own mosques, gardens, kitchens, hospitals, and a separate city within a city that no man except the Sultan was permitted to enter, the harem. The word doesn't mean what most people think it means. It comes from the Arabic haram, forbidden, sacred, protected. It wasn't a brothel, it was an institution, a system with its own hierarchy, its own economy, its own politics, its own language, and its own particular brand of cruelty that left no marks on the skin. When a girl entered the harem, the first thing they took was her name. Not immediately, not dramatically. There was no ceremony of erasure. It happened slowly, the way all effective erasures happen, through repetition. She was called by a new name. Everyone around her used the new name. The old name went unspoken until it became something she kept only inside her head, a private possession in a place where private possessions were not permitted. The second thing they took was her religion. Conversion was expected, not demanded at sword point. The Ottomans were more sophisticated than that. It happened through the simple pressure of total immersion. Prayers 5 times a day, Arabic lessons, the Quran read aloud in the evenings, no church, no priest, no one to speak to in her own language about her own God. Conversion, in the harem, was the path of least resistance, and least resistance was the only path that led anywhere survivable. The third thing they took was time. A girl could spend years, decades, in the harem without ever seeing the Sultan, without ever leaving the palace walls, without ever knowing if the life she was being prepared for would ever materialize, or if preparation itself was the entire life. Some women entered the harem at 13 and left it at 40, having never advanced beyond the lowest tier of the hierarchy, having served as attendants to other women who had themselves never advanced. The system was a pyramid. Most of the pyramid was base. The ones who survived, who more than survived, who rose, understood something quickly. The harem was not a prison, it was a competition. Every woman around you was your competitor. The younger ones who arrived after you were threats. The older ones who arrived before you were obstacles. The hierarchy was maintained through a system of ranks that determined what you ate, where you slept, what clothes you wore, and whether the Sultan would ever know you existed. At the bottom, the carrier, servant women, the newest arrivals. They cleaned, they cooked, they attended. They were invisible except when required to be visible. Above them, the gozde, women who had caught the Sultan's attention at least once. One glance, one conversation, enough to be noticed, not enough to be remembered. Above them, the iqbal, women who had spent a night with the Sultan. Their status changed overnight, literally. New quarters, better food, a personal attendant, but also higher stakes. An iqbal who failed to retain the Sultan's interest fell, slowly, back toward invisibility, and at the top, the hasiki, the Sultan's favorite, the woman who had produced a son. In the Ottoman system, a son was the only currency that bought permanent security. A son meant a potential sultan. A potential sultan meant that his mother's position was tied to the empire's succession, tied to it in both directions. If your son became sultan, you became valide sultan, the most powerful woman in the empire, the woman the Grand Vizier addressed as master. If your son didn't become sultan, if another woman's son took the throne instead, the Ottoman fratricide law required the new sultan to execute every potential rival, every son except his own. Every Iqbal, every Haseki, every Carrier who had produced a son that was not the new sultan lived with this calculation. The women in the harem were not competing for comfort, they were competing for their children's lives. Hold that, because before we get to what this system produced, before we get to what it did to the women inside it and the empire around it, you need to understand one more thing. The girls who entered the harem were not for the most part slaves in the way that word is commonly understood. They were not beaten in chains, they were not worked to exhaustion in fields, they lived in a palace. They were educated, music, poetry, embroidery, conversation, the Quran. They were fed, clothed, and housed better than most people in the 16th century Ottoman world, and they had no way out. There was no ransom, no rescue, no appeal. A family who tried to reclaim a girl taken for the harem was challenging the Sultan's authority directly. Nobody did that twice. The girls who wept for their mothers in the first weeks learned, because they had to learn, to stop weeping. Weeping accomplished nothing except to mark you as someone who hadn't yet adapted. And adaptation was survival. The Venetian ambassadors stationed in Istanbul filed detailed reports about the harem, not because they were invited inside, no foreigner was ever invited inside, but because they paid palace servants for information. These reports survive in the Venetian state archives. They describe a world that the official Ottoman chronicles never recorded, a world where women formed alliances like diplomats, where information was the primary currency, where a piece of gossip about the Sultan's mood, delivered to the right woman at the right moment, could accelerate a career, where the same gossip, delivered to the wrong woman, could end one, a world where the Valid Sultan, the Sultan's mother, was in many cases more powerful than the Sultan himself. She had been there longer, she knew the machinery, she knew every woman in the building, their histories, their alliances, their vulnerabilities. A young Sultan entering the throne for the first time was often navigating a political environment that his mother had been constructing for decades. The Venetian reports record, without commentary, that when a new sultan took power, certain arrangements were made regarding the previous sultan's concubines who had not produced the heir. The reports use the phrase, removed from the palace. They do not specify what this removal involved. The Ottoman records of the same period contain no mention of these women at all. They simply disappear from the record. The women who rose furthest, who climbed from Carrier to Haseki to Valide Sultan, left behind the most documentation. Their letters survive. Their charitable foundations still stand in Istanbul. The mosques they funded still receive worshippers every day. The women who didn't rise left nothing. No letters, no buildings, no names. Not even the new names they were given when they entered, because those names were only ever attached to women who mattered enough to be recorded. The ones who didn't matter were never recorded at all. There was a nun from Thessaly. Her name in Greek was Agathonike. She entered the harem in 1521, taken during a raid on a monastery that had been converted to a civilian settlement after a previous war. She was 22, older than most of the new arrivals. A literacy in 3 languages, Greek, Latin, and enough Arabic to read the Quran, made her unusual. She was assigned as a reader, an attendant to the Valide Sultan, reading aloud from religious texts, a position that gave her access to rooms most Carrier never entered and conversations most Carrier never heard. She kept a record, not a diary in the modern sense, a series of notations hidden inside the binding of a Greek prayer book she had managed to keep, concealed among her few permitted possessions. Short entries, names, dates, events, written in a cramped hand in a cipher she had devised herself, mixing Greek letters with Latin abbreviations. The prayer book survived. It was found in 1923 in a private collection in Athens, purchased at auction in the aftermath of the population exchanges between Greece and Turkey that followed the First World War. The cipher was decoded in 1958 by a Greek scholar named Georgios Pantelakis. His paper was published in an academic journal with a circulation of approximately 300. It has never been translated into English. What Agathonici recorded covers 7 years, 1521 to 1528. 7 years inside the innermost spaces of the most powerful court in the world, seen by a woman who had no political allegiance to protect and no future to safeguard except her own survival. She records the arrival of new girls, their names before and after, the speed with which some adapted, and the cost of that adaptation written in their faces during the brief moments when the performance slipped. She records deaths, 2 women in 7 years, both recorded officially as illness, both following periods of proximity to political disputes she describes without fully understanding. She records, in the entry for 1524, the arrival of a young woman from Ukraine, red-haired, exceptional memory, the ability to make the Sultan laugh. The new woman's given name was Alexandra. The name they gave her was Harem. History knows what happened next. Agathonic recorded it from the inside. Her entry for the day Harem was first summoned to the Sultan reads, "She returned before dawn. She said nothing to anyone, but in the morning her eyes were different." 7 words. 7 words that contain an entire shift in the power structure of an empire. Because Agathonice, who had watched the harem for 3 years by that point, understood something the historians who came later did not. The shift wasn't about romance. It wasn't about beauty. It was about recognition. One person finding another person in a place where personhood was systematically dismantled, and what that recognition meant for the system that depended on the dismantling. Agathonic's record ends abruptly in 1528. The last entry is a single line. It says, "I have been moved, I do not know where. If anyone finds this, tell them we were here." The prayer book was found 400 years later in a private collection in Athens. Nobody told anyone. Not because the story was suppressed, because no one was looking. The harem is still there. The palace is a museum. Tourists walk through the tiled corridors every day, past the latticed windows and the marble fountains and the great central hall where the women gathered. The building remembers. Agathonique's prayer book is in a private collection in Athens. Its current owner has declined to make it publicly available. The cipher Pantelakis decoded sits in an academic journal published in 1958, in a language most of the world doesn't read, in a field most of the world doesn't follow. We were here. If this story reached something in you, subscribe, because the history they didn't teach you is always darker, always stranger, and always more human than the version they did.